Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Podcasting with a Vision. It is such a joy to have you all join us here for this very inspiring educational webinar where we speak with some amazing podcasters and hear their wonderful, wonderful journeys. Podcasters with visual impairments, but they've been incredibly determined and creative, and you'll hear their personal experiences. You will hear some of the things they've learned. And we will also hopefully get into ways to make podcasting more inclusive for all the creators with all sorts of abilities. So today we have with us, in no particular order, Michael Hinkson, who is the New York Times bestselling author and international lecturer, also the Chief Vision Officer for XSEB. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We've also got John and Larry Gassman, who, when I Googled, Google told me they are identical twins born on January 2nd, 1955, which made me very happy. John has retired from Disney after 20 years and was the first totally visually impaired person ever hired at Disneyland Resort. The podcasting career includes producing Freedom Scientific's monthly podcast along with twin brother Larry. Then we have Walton Hughes, the general manager of Yesterday USA Radio Network, who's been broadcasting since 1983. Walton's interviewed all sorts of celebrities from radio, film, TV. And yeah, those are our panelists today, and I'll hand you over to them.
We have lots of things to discuss. It is not going to fit in the hour. I'll guarantee you that. So we'll have to do the Reader's Digest short form version whenever we can.
And if we start making stuff up, we're going to go into a second hour without any problem. So
we all have several things in common, but one is a love for radio, a love for the spoken word, and a love for podcasts. We all do it in different ways. John and I started in probably 1970 and began doing radio and had continued to do radio weekly, plus a myriad of podcasts, etc. So besides full-time jobs, I worked for Marriott for 20 years, retired. Now I work for the American Council of the Blind part-time and continue to do the radio show and all the other stuff. I'm busy 24/7. And all of us are incredibly busy because that makes life much more fun and enjoyable. And we get to do what we want to do because most of us are either retired or just not working. And so we get a chance to drop in podcasts and do things that we wonder, gee, what would this be like if we were to do this? And we have that opportunity now because we're old, well, older. Or we're older and we have that flexibility. And we all gained it from different viewpoints or different ways. You know, John and I just grew up loving it. I mean, Michael, I don't know when you started. Probably did you start before or after 9/11 with regard to podcasts?
Well, with regard to podcasts, after 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, 9/11 was a great vehicle to get you involved in that pursuit.
But I also had been doing radio since 1960. Well, probably April of 1969. Yeah, so I've been doing it before you. But when I joined XSEB, they asked me to do a podcast, and I said, "What do you want?" And they said, "We don't care," which really is open-ended, right? So we started Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. And it's worded that way because if you talk to diversity people and ask them about diversity, they'll talk to you about gender, sexual orientation, and race, but they won't talk to you about disabilities. And when you ask them, well, why don't you include disabilities? Oh, that's more social justice. Balderdash. 25% roughly of all people in the world, and in the United States specifically, according to the Center for Disease Controls, have some sort of disability. Now, the reality is everyone in the world has a disability, and we can talk about that, but
that's another podcast.
That's another whole podcast.
Yeah, well,
because most people are light dependent, and unfortunately, they talk to us about being visually impaired, and we're not visually impaired. And I think that's a term that we need to get rid of for two reasons. Visually, we're not different simply because we're blind. The professionals created this term, And it's been used to really subjugate us in a lot of ways. But visually, we're not different simply because we don't see. Impaired, we are not.
We can just turn off the light. We can just turn off the light, and nobody would know.
We can turn off the light, and the rest of you guys can run around trying to find a light source. Thomas Edison
charge you $1, and we'll help you out. Yeah.
Thomas Edison created the electric light bulb to give light-dependent people light on demand. So are the rest of you blind impaired? The reality is we're blind and low vision, but not visually impaired.
No.
Because we've got to get that terminology out of society.
It's a social term because people don't want to use the word
blind.
No, they don't. And so they use another term to mask that, like visually impaired.
Right.
Blind or low vision is very well accepted by the blindness community, by those who are low visioned as well.
And it's growing. More and more people. And the reality is it's a much better term. I mean, blind is what we ought to use because blindness is a more generally relevant term, but we're going to accept blind and low
That's
vision.
Fine. That's fine.
We can live with that. And the reality is, by the way, we can do podcasts like the rest of the world. Another term that we often hear is differently abled or different abilities. No, we have the same abilities. We may use different tools and technologies
to get there,
to accomplish tasks, but we're not different in terms of abilities and everything else. And that's, I think, the biggest issue that we have to deal with. When I worked at KUCI, University of California at Irvine radio station, I ran the board. I did everything that I needed to do. And I learned how to do that without being able to see the audio meter and other things like that. There are ways to do that.
Yep.
And so I did, and had a lot of fun doing it. And of course, now doing podcasts is so much better than what we did with radio because when I was doing radio, it was all editing by cutting tape, splicing tape, and I wasn't a very good tape splicer. Now we do everything electronically, and you'd never know it.
No,
we haven't let Walden talk yet, and I think that's.
And we're not really going to do that.
That was a good thing. Yeah.
Yes.
All right, Walden, get your 30 seconds in.
No, 10 seconds.
Let me get through this in. I think for our audience, they probably like to know the process everybody does here to create a podcast or an audio.
Well, it's different. We have to explain some terms first because, as Michael said, we do some things a little differently to get to the same results. We all use a screen reader because we need to be able to know what's on the screen. The screen doesn't talk to us. We don't have to have everything in Braille. That's an interesting misconception that most sighted people think is necessary. Oh, you must have it all in Braille.
Only 10% of all blind people read Braille anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice if you can, but not everybody can use Braille.
Braille is the main means by which we read and write.
Correct.
But the reality is we have the luxury of having other tools that we can use that are audio-based when Braille is not available. And a lot of people say, well, you don't need Braille because you can do everything audio-wise. Well, no, you can't. And the reality is that Braille, as I said, is the means by which we read and write. And what that means is it's how we learn to spell. It's how we learn to deal with sentences. It's how we learn to do the same things that all of you use a pen or a pencil for. And by the way, we use the same keyboard you use because we don't need to have Braille characters on it. And any good typist will tell you don't look at the keyboard when you're typing anyway. Or any good musician who plays the piano will tell you that you do it by feel, essentially.
I'm so thankful that I read Braille because it keeps my mind relevant. It also tells me and reminds me.
I don't know about your mind.
All right, that's
I don't know
podcast.
about your mind.
You guys can stop now.
Go on, John. Tell him.
It keeps me.
I've told him. He doesn't believe me, but I've told him.
As I was saying before, I was so rudely interrupted.
Not too rudely.
It wasn't actually rudely. It was just interrupted.
Poor Larry. So how he suffers.
Shut up, Walden.
Shut up, Walden. So what I was trying to get at is because I read Braille, I love the fact that I can read Braille because as I look over something that somebody else has written, it reminds me of what words look like, how they're spelled. And, if you don't read Braille for, years, it shows when you write to somebody because you forget things in terms of how to write. And believe me, without saying anything disparagingly, I know blind people who never really learned Braille, and their grammar and their ability to write is often atrocious. So when I get the chance to read what someone else has written or read a book, just any book in Braille, it reminds me, oh yeah, that's how that word looks, or that's how that sentence was put together. So I use Braille for a lot of different purposes, and that's one of them, just to make sure that what I'm doing is correct and will be seen by others as I write it as good.
One of the things that I do. Oh, go ahead, Walden, and then
I use Braille basically as a way to keep schedules and calendars. I like to have something in my hot little hand, when I'm booking guests, things like that.
It's not necessarily always what you do to write Braille. It's what others do that you can actually look at,
right?
To make sure that what you're writing is correct in terms of sentence structure, in terms of grammar, and that is so important.
One of the things want to keep up on what is supposedly accurate, I read at church, not every Sunday because in front of people.
As a lector, right?
I'm a lector at my church, so I do read from about once or twice a month. And you talk about sometimes major league words that go on for about a page and a half.
Oh my gosh,
for one word, yeah.
For one word, yeah. So, I mean, that, for me, it's good Braille training to have to do that at least once or twice a month. And then from time to time, you write something out in advance when you're doing a podcast. So it's scripted. Not everything is, but occasionally. And that allows you to just talk and sound like you are just in a nice conversation with somebody, and that you keep that up by reading and writing. So Braille does play a major part in our lives.
So one of the things that I do with Braille, working at Accessibility, I do a lot of onboarding and training of people, and because I do that, there are slides involved. And yes, blind people can do slideshows. We can do PowerPoint like anyone else. And when I am doing that, and I can tell other stories about it, but when I'm doing that, I have the entire script of the slideshow, slide by slide, including descriptions of the pictures, so I remember from time to time what's on the slide. But I can use and do use Braille to read that script. I've had other situations where, in podcasts and other places, where I use Braille because it is the means by which blind people read and write. Audio doesn't replace Braille. It never will, and it shouldn't. And again, we're talking about this to all of you because what we're really trying to say is, look, it's not different for us to do a podcast than it is for you to do a podcast. We may use different tools, but we still do the same podcast. We ultimately get to the same place. We use most of us, or a lot of us, use an audio editor called Reaper to actually be able to go back and edit what is recorded and do things with it. It's the most accessible. There have been a lot of operations done to make sure that Reaper is accessible. There are other tools that are available too, but the bottom line is we have tools, and us doing a podcast is really no different than you, other than using different tools. Some of you are left-handed, some of you are right-handed, and you have to make some adjustments to deal with that because we're really primarily a right-handed world. So for lefties, it can be a challenge. But the reality is that we all know how to deal with the different specific gifts that we have.
When you go to a restaurant and you're left-handed, you're going to sit in a place that you normally may not sit at if you were right-handed. And so, I mean, those are the kinds of things. It's a little different with podcasting, but you have to make choices. And so do we. And maybe it would be a good idea maybe for us to go through what we do when it's time to do a podcast, the kinds of things we do, especially as relates to those choices that we make that are different than what sighted people would do.
Before we do that, I will just throw in, just for information, and this is not a podcast. Larry and I, back in 1986, 87, 88, did play-by-play for the Rose Parade for National Public Radio station that we were on, and all of
and for the network. Yeah.
And one of the toughest things that happened to us was that, of course, we were doing the parade on January 1st in 35-degree weather. And we had before the parade, we went to the float builders and we did interviews, and we had all this script in Braille
that we brailled.
And this is long before Braille displays became available.
No takers.
So forth. Mm-hmm. So we sat up there in the booth with everybody else who was doing some type of television work or radio work on the parade. But because our fingers got cold, they got desensitized, and it was really tough to feel the dots. So what we had to do was we brought in a
heating element, heating pad. Yeah.
So while Larry was talking, I would put my fingers on the heating pad to warm my fingers up. Then I would talk for a while and read, and he would do the same thing. And we switched off so that we always had warm fingers in order to do the parade.
And in a sense, how is that any different than a sighted person having a situation where they're maybe doing a news broadcast or report and they have bright lights that are kind of blinding them? You know, the point being, it's different issues that amount to the same thing. And what we should never do is negate anyone's gifts over anyone else's gifts.
It's a good thing that there were two of us, because it would have been much more difficult if it had just been one. Mm-hmm. You know, how do you talk while you're warming up your fingers at the same time? Well, I guess you pad a lot. And we sometimes had to do that too. Anyway, so podcasts. Now, we did a ton of radio. So did Mike. And we've done podcasts over the years. Michael, of course, has now as well. But maybe we can kind of go... Walden hasn't done as much in terms of podcasting, but
I've done 1,000 of them.
He's done lots of.
Well, these are interviews for the radio show, but for the generic term podcast,
same concept.
I've released 1,000 over SoundCloud and other places.
Same process.
All right. So the thought is, let's talk about what we do when we do podcast, especially as it relates to the different tools we use to get to the same point as everybody else. We just do it a little differently.
So when I do podcasts, I have chosen to use Zoom, which has worked really well, to actually do the podcast. Some of the technologies that people use are less accessible than Zoom. Zoom really lucked out because they were smart enough when the pandemic began to put an accessibility team together and really did a lot to make sure that Zoom was a lot more accessible than it had been in the past. Yeah. Some of the other products like StreamYard work, but they're not as easy to do from a screen reader. So I choose to use Zoom. And before I do a podcast, I will go on to Zoom and I will do sound checks of my own to make sure that I am sounding good to my headset and me. And I will do whatever, and I will take the time to make sure that that is set up right. One of the things that I require all of my guests to do is to use a decent microphone. So what we don't do is really want anyone to use like a camera on a laptop or a microphone embedded into the screen of a laptop. We want at least decent headsets or decent microphones. And that is because we're very sensitive to the needs of listeners to have decent audio. And if you're not doing decent audio, people get distracted or they won't listen to you. And it's a very important thing to make sure that the audio is good. So I check out me, and I have actually asked a couple of people to reschedule because they have not had good microphones, even though that has been requested by me in our initial get-togethers and in the letters that I send to people telling them what we need to do the podcast right. I am amazed sometimes at people and how they just don't pay attention to things. So it can be a real challenge. Larry's laughing at that, but it's right. You know, it is a challenge. But I put that together and then record the podcast, which is a conversation. I can but choose not to edit it unless there's some sort of glitch to audio or whatever. And then I have actually a company I work with called Amplify U that does a lot of the back office stuff, but I can also do it and sometimes do some of the editing as well. But I go off and do other things, like I continue to travel and speak, like I talked about going to London a little earlier, and we'll be doing that and going to other places. So it's nice to have a support group to help make that happen. But the bottom line is, again, I use different tools sometimes, and sometimes the same tools, to accomplish the same task.
I think I do remember, and some of you won't even know what I'm talking about, but I do remember in the days when we used to have to go to the radio station to actually bring our stuff in.
Back in the day.
In the 70s and 80s, we would edit, and we would edit open reel recorders, or open reel recordings, tape, with scissors and tape, and it was hideously, it was horrible.
I was with electronic editing too, and that was pretty good, but it did take time.
I was not a good splicer. I mean, I could tell.
I wasn't either, because I could never splice them straight.
I was good electronically, but you couldn't be as exact as you can with a digital edit.
We have for the stuff that we do with either radio or podcasting, or lots of stuff that I do for ACB, American Council of the Blind, I'll interview people, and we'll either use Zoom or Clean Feed or something like that. But and by the way, I will not do anything with somebody on the phone. Purposely,
it's not good audio,
because it's the audio. It used to be 40 years ago, but that's because we didn't have what we have now. Now that we have this quality with Zoom, Clean Feed, whatever it might be, it's just not acceptable for most people to hear people on the phone, especially with varying degrees of quality from the phone. So I will try and do whatever I can.
And the reality is, you can get good audio. I mean, I've heard so many interviews where people are clearly talking with their embedded microphone on their laptop or their camera or whatever, and there's no need for that today.
No.
And then
an iPhone makes it easy.
The TV networks do that too, even to this day, and I never could understand it.
Yeah.
Okay, so iPhones make it better. It makes it easier. It sounds like you may be but it's not. It's better than the landline telephone.
Yeah.
We also, John and I, spent, I don't know, $3,000-$4,000 a few years ago each on a good quality mixer, a Hoyle PR40 microphone, which I'm talking into now. I have a mobile setup so that when I travel and do interviews remotely, it's going to sound almost as good as this, hopefully as good as this, and other kinds of equipment that I'm not going to go into here. But we want the podcast experience to be a pleasant one for everybody when they're listening. And sometimes you have to do that with good, solid equipment. You can't just throw something together. And so we believe that a good quality microphone and equipment is just as important as whatever is said on the podcast. And
for the computer, when we did the FS Cast podcast, Freedom Scientific, we basically were asked to interview individuals who had something to do with technology, and probably more JAWS than anything else, because that's what the
JAWS is the screen reader we use. You have to explain that.
So we did the interviews, and then we used JAWS on the keyboard to edit everything and submit it. And unfortunately, the COVID knocked us out of that because there was no cash flow to pay us anymore. So that's, the way it goes. So
by
now
the way,
we're
JAWS,
other related stuff.
JAWS stands for Job Access with Speech, just for those who wonder why is anything called JAWS. You don't hear the music in the background from John Williams. It's different.
It's a little different. I mean, I could put it in there. We could do it right now.
We could edit it,
Yeah, we could.
Sure.
I do most of my own editing for things that I do. John does some as well, and we do it all digitally using sound editors. And Reaper is probably the best of the sound editors. Its learning curve is very steep.
It is.
But because some of the other sound editors that we've used over the years are getting more graphic intensive, which means scripts have to be written, and so it makes it more difficult for us to use some of those.
SoundForge still pretty well works, and Goldwave works.
Pretty much. pretty much.
Goldwave, but still Reaper has become the more sophisticated one. I think another thing to point out, you were talking about doing things remotely and having equipment to do that. One of the challenges that we've had over the years is that digital recorders, good digital recorders, have primarily not been overly accessible. And we've started to see that change. It should have changed a lot sooner, but now you have companies like Zoom that have made the H2, the H4, and the H6 essential.
Different Zoom, by the way. It's not
different
Zoom that we're platforming on now. It's a company called
It's
Zoom.
a company.
Yeah.
And they have begun, there's still work to do, but they have begun to make their a number of their products accessible. And Zoom certainly is one of the premier digital recorder companies. And so it's great to see that we're now getting more access from that standpoint, because we want to be able to do the same things that others do when we're talking about doing remote broadcasting or remote recording.
It is so nice that everything pretty much in the menus talks.
Today.
Right. And it's a handheld recorder, so you can take it with you on the road to maybe a convention or to a family get-together or whatever you might want to record. You can stream with it if you're out somewhere and want to stream with it, and everything is accessible and it's broadcast quality. So I really like the new recorder.
We're excited by that,
Since March. Yeah. By the way, Wallen, are you awake?
No.
Walden, your turn. You get the next 20 minutes, Walden.
Yeah, we left the last 20 minutes for you. So talk about some of the things, because you do things a little bit differently than we do.
I do. My really radio focus, because that's what my big responsibility is, running a 24-hour internet radio station, which has been around since 1983.
Walden, tap your mic, because you're.
Yeah, I just noticed this one out.
There you go.
Anyway.
Okay.
Anyway,
that's the technical part of today. It doesn't get any more technical than that.
That's why Larry's on the podcast today, just to tell Walden to tap his mic.
My $3,000 microphone just got tapped on.
I was going to get that chance before we ended today.
But anyway, so one of the things I am driven for is booking guests. On a minimum side, I probably have booked close to 1,500 guests over the last 20 years. And my interest is mostly nostalgia-based entertainment, but I will get into history. I will get into people who have unique things, or small-town America, whatever. And in the old days, it used to be letter writing, and it used to be for a cold letter, it's about 20% batting average with well-known celebrities, and I always figured I was a pretty good batting average. But a lot of my time is spent looking around the net, looking for ideas, guests, booking them, reaching them, working with contacts. And the more people we interview, like my contact list, it's over 300 pages. The more we interview, the more networking, and the more ideas, and the more people, the more things. So it comes easier over the years. And I think networking is really important to that. I think one thing I wish I had more time to do is the marketing aspect of doing this. You're so busy running the radio station, booking guests, making sure the bills are paid, that just getting the marketing out is something that if there was another me, that's what I would be focusing on. Because
we should mention that John and I began collecting in the old radio shows in 1970. We've been working in radio since then. We started working with this station that Walden is alluding to now, called Yesterday USA. It started in 1983. We began in 86. Walden came along a little bit later, and we booked guests for them. We booked guests for Radio Society. John and I did a lot of the stuff that Walden is now doing. But the interviews with all of these people who were then alive were important to us. And we wanted to make sure that they were recorded so that people who come along now, long after the people we talked about are gone, have some way to hear the stories that these people told about radio specifically. And so when Walden talks about the fact that he books now things for Yesterday USA, things that we don't do as much anymore because our lives have taken off. we're still involved, but they've taken off in different directions. He's doing a ton of stuff to make sure that these memories are all preserved, and we all are, based on the fact that we interview all these people.
And isn't to a large degree, that is also what podcasting is about? We're interviewing people, we're talking to people, and we want to save those. Unstoppable Mindset is all about giving people an opportunity to come on the podcast and tell their stories. And I believe that everyone has a story to tell. There's not one person who doesn't have a story to tell, and oftentimes people will say, "Well, I don't have a story," or "I'm not really good at talking." My job as the podcast host is to help them realize that they're probably better than they think they are, and then when they come on the podcast and do enjoy being on for an hour, the other thing that we get to say is, we've all worked together now to help all of our listeners see that they can be more unstoppable than they thought they could.
Yep.
Which is really important. But I'm actually, this morning, episode 269 of Unstoppable Mindset was released, and that's been since August of 2021. So we're doing pretty well with it, and it's pretty visible, and always enjoy getting more guests. But the reality is that it's really about preserving memories, and that's important to do.
I think with a big skill set that we all have, and I think it's really important for it to be a good listener. Mm-hmm. I think that's the key of a good interview is to listen to your guests and then do follow-up questions with your guests.
We learned a long time ago, John and I did, and we still believe this so strongly today. But not everybody follows it. All you have to do is listen to radio and TV, and it's not about us.
No.
It's about the person we're interviewing, and I'm sorry, but there are people today in positions where they're getting paid a lot more money than I am who think it's all about me.
Yeah.
And you can tell in the first 30 seconds based on how they react towards a guest. And it's not about us. We're there to ask questions, keep them short, and let the guest talk. Now, we can direct, we can push in a certain way if we want to get things out that we want them to talk about, because we know that they're generally going to be writing books and talking about their books. So we're there to kind of steer to some degree, but it's not about us. It's about them. And it's always going to be that way when you're in a position to do radio and TV, etc.
I think we're blessed because we live here in Southern California, the four of us, that we listen to really good talk radio. And,
absolutely. Yeah.
And John and Larry were good friends with Ray Bream. All of you guys worked with Larry King on one degree or another. And those were the best of the best in terms of interviewing. I mean, I think that's what Larry King's secret was when he was interviewing the guest. It wasn't about him. It was about the guest, as Larry was saying.
Well, all you had to do was listen to people, and we had Vin Scully. We had Chick Hearn. We had Bob Kelly, Dick Enberg in the L.A. area, who were prolific, incredible broadcasters. And I listened to their approaches. And they would ask a question that took no more than 5 to 10 seconds to ask, and then they'd let the guest talk. And we had those role models here in the Los Angeles area, and I'm not saying that New York didn't and Chicago didn't. They had their own, but generally all of these people in these other areas as well knew to get out of the way and let the guest talk.
Yeah, it's really about, the guest and what the guest has to say. And when you're looking to be a guest on a podcast, you also want to not let your ego get in the way, but why do you want to be on the podcast? What are you going to accomplish? And that's about dealing with your listeners and the listeners of the podcast. So it's really important to keep ego out of it, and all levels, but definitely it's never about the podcaster. It is more about the guests, and it's more about what the guest is going to contribute to the audience. And the people who get that are invariably the best guests and end up doing the best podcast episodes for the presentations.
I'm curious now about and we're going to lump everything together as a podcast. We may do different forms of it. It might be a radio show, whatever. But when you prepare for a quote radio show or a quote podcast, What do you do? Larry King told me he never read books. He wanted that personal experience when he asked the question to the guest. Other people read incessantly before they get in to talk to a guest. So it depends on your methodology. What do you want to do? What makes you feel most comfortable? And I'm curious as to, as we wander around the panel here, how you guys prepare for what you're going to do with a guest.
I have to read a little bit. I don't want to go in cold, but I want to do just enough cold so that I can react to what somebody is saying. But I have to know the basics about the individual so I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
but you're not going to read chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter.
Well, if I have time, I will. But you don't always have time.
But that's not the But reading isn't the purpose, so that you are so programmed that all you're doing is parroting the book.
Correct.
And like you mentioned, Larry King. The first time I was interviewed by Larry, he got some things wrong. That it's unfortunate that he did, but that's typical when you're dealing with people who don't know anything about blindness. Larry was very knowledgeable about a lot of things. What we learned was that we could provide Larry with the information in terms of what questions to ask, not talking about the answers, but what questions to ask. And if he wanted to know more, he would ask ahead of time. But generally that didn't happen. But we did sort of program Larry, and that worked out really well. And in working with other people, I've encountered people who have read my books and then they interview me, but them reading the books and the way they operated was all about trying to come up with the most insightful and really good questions. And I found that people who read my books or who studied up on blindness generally asked very good questions. Because they took the time to prepare, but they did it with the intent of coming up with good questions, not trying to impress me because they read my book or whatever. So it does run the gambit, but I think that it is important to put some preparation into it. One of the things that I ask every guest that I have on the podcast is I want them to send me some things. One, I want a bio. I want a 4 or 5 paragraph bio. If it's not long enough, I'll react and say I need it longer. But it's also because I want to use that in the show notes. That is the notes that go along with the podcast for people to read. I also want any of their links, their contact links, social media links, and so on, pictures of book covers, a photo of them. The other thing I ask people to send me is a list of at least 8 questions that they want to cover. Now, what I tell people is I'm not going to ask you those questions directly. I turn them into what I call conversation springboards. That is, I use those questions because that tells me what they want to talk about, and they know more about what they want to talk about than I do anyway. At least I hope they do. So I want the questions because I just want short things to look at, but I turn those into conversation springboards. And as long as people send me at least 8, I think my record is like 22, but they started getting a little bit repetitive at that. So, but still, when people ask or send me those questions and I can really study them and think about them, I come up with the data that I need. So I don't read a lot of a person's book ahead of time. Most of the time, they're not accessible books anyway. But I get the information that I need, and when I get that, it turns out to be a great interview.
Yeah, and I'm kind of the same way. And by accessible books, what wasn't accessible even 10 years ago is now. There are several different sources we now can go to, and there are ways with screen readers and other kinds of technology. We can read almost any book that's out there. From an accessible standpoint, there are ways to make that happen, which is not the way it was 5 years ago. Not at all.
We have optical character recognition that began with Ray Kurzweil back in the 70s, and I had the pleasure of being a part of that process. But Omnifon optical character recognition helps. But today, that is even in a sense a slower way than so many other ways of doing things. I'll use OCR where I don't have access in any other way, but so much material today is in an electronic form, and unless it's graphic, which means the screen reader can't interpret it, I'm able to to get the material that I need. And if it is graphic, even now AI is starting
AI
to
is
change
incredible.
that, because AI is interpreting graphics, and we're seeing more and more of that happen. So again, what that means is a lot more information is becoming available and giving us the tools to access that same information that other people have access to.
So let's go back and let Walden answer the last question.
Right.
It's interesting, my co-host Patricia, who is unique, she's a sighted person in the group of us. You got 4 blind guys here. But she is a professional writer, and sometimes she'll prepare 30 pages worth of notes for every show. I like having notes. Bullet points is what I do. I like looking at the bio. When PR companies contact me for a guest, they generally give me a bio, which I like. A lot of book publishers are now very good about sending their books in PDF electronic formats, which is really helpful for us.
And they're non-graphic PDFs, they're actual documents.
Yeah, and also I think what helps to make a really good podcast or a good interview is life experiences. I think the 4 of us all are a very unique person, and my interests are very diverse, from history to politics to entertainment to a lot of different things. And so I think some of your best hosts are ones who have a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, and a lot of different things, and so they can tap into those things when a guest takes a left-hand turn or a right-hand turn. Because I like to listen and figure out where the guest goes. The toughest guests for me are the ones that gives you yes, no answers based upon open-ended questions.
We've all had that happen.
Yeah,
that's a
and
bear
we've all
cat.
had that happen.
Yeah.
And that's a bear cat.
It also helps when you've got, and all of us can do this, it also helps when you're able to think and react quickly. And if something doesn't go right, where somebody says, yes, you got to go there. You got to go somewhere with that. You can't just let them say yes and have 10 seconds of dead air.
So tell me more
You've got
about
to feel
that. So tell me more about that. I hear exactly what and that's exactly the kind of thing that you have to do. Tell me more about it.
It's funny because I interviewed a radio personality who didn't know me, and he started giving me...
He was a movie actor as well, Howard Duff.
Okay, yes and no answers. And then I began, so I thought, okay,
he never did that on his own radio show, but anyway, go ahead.
But he did when I interviewed him. And so I thought I got to figure out a way to get him to stop this. So I started asking questions that only somebody knowledgeable about his subject, meaning radio, television, movies, would ask, to let him know that I wasn't just some interviewer who took a minimum amount of time and preparation. So I asked him, what about, for instance, did you ever work with Lauren Bacall? Did you ever how was it working with Lorene Tuttle, who I knew he had worked with in the past?
Sure.
And when he began to realize I knew something about the subject, all of a sudden he warmed up. Mm-hmm. And those yeses and nos became sometimes 2 and 3 minute answers. And then after that, it was easy. It was fun. But sometimes you've got to know what to do to stop that from happening, because that's deadly for almost any interview. And I was going to say, it is 45 after. Ladies, when it's time for us to stop so we can do Q&A, you let us know, because we're not paying attention. Well, I'm not, and if you're going to wave at me, I know I'm not going to pay attention.
Yeah, we're going to do our best not to. Yeah,
so just let us know. Go ahead.
I think a big example we have, because we lived here and we're so well connected, is the people that we know that network and talk to other people. So they come up with really good. I mean, for example, the 4 of us have been very blessed to know Margaret O'Brien, who won an Academy Award winner. And in the early days, people reached her. She was generally a little hesitant. But because we invited her to events and we have interviewed her, I noticed, didn't you notice the last guy, when we talked to her last, how relaxed she was with you guys up on stage?
She's been that way for us several times now, but she wasn't the first time.
Correct.
Because she didn't know us.
Correct.
And she didn't know me until we met this last time, but very quickly she did get... But
she began to trust us, because she knew that we were in it for her best interest, and we weren't going to say anything or do anything that would hurt her. And once that trust element came through, It was a piece of cake. It was like having a conversation with your next door neighbor.
But that's a really
maybe
good
that's
point.
Not a good term to use. Maybe not your next door neighbor, because most people don't know their next door neighbors.
Right, but you bring a good point. It is about trust, and
it's all about trust.
And for us to be able to talk to guests, they do need to learn to trust us. Now, I had a conversation with someone who was a software engineer, and when we initially began talking, he said, I don't really want to talk a lot about being a software engineer. I said, well, I need you to do a little bit of that, but what do you want to talk about? And he said, I really want to talk about what I like to do when I'm not being a software engineer, and that is I love to go swimming in the Pacific Ocean. He lived in Dana Point. And he said, I love to go swim in the ocean at least every other day without a wetsuit.
Wow.
And I never thought about it a lot until we started to talk, and then suddenly, because I had begun a project of writing a book, which now is published, called Live Like a Guide Dog, I began writing this book to talk about fear and learning to control fear, and recognizing that fear is something that you can control, and it doesn't need to, as I put it, blind you or overwhelm you. But when we were talking and we started talking about the ocean and swimming, it just came into my head to say, tell me what it was like the first time you wanted to swim in the ocean in the dead of winter. And he said, good question. He said, it's interesting because, and he started to talk, but he said, it's interesting because as I was getting closer to the water, when I decided I was going to do this, he said, I noticed I was slowing down. And then he said, I just got to do this. And he said, I jumped in. Within a couple of seconds, I was used to the water, and I've been swimming in the ocean in the winter ever since, swimming nose to nose with a dolphin and doing other kinds of things like that. But the reality is that the question was relevant. It's the kind of thing that he really did want to talk about. And it's important for me as a podcast host never to betray a guest and to do anything that's going to cause that person to not trust me. Now, I've had a couple of people say, I don't think I did a good podcast. Can we do it over? And I have said, look, you did great, and you don't have anything to fear. I've had one person who said, I don't want my podcast published, which is too bad. But other people have accepted that, and it is a matter of trust. But I'm listening to it. I'm looking at all the information afterward, and I know what it was like. And it's important to build that trust. And any good podcast host has to do more than just doing an interview. You've got to establish a relationship, and a trusting relationship with the person you're talking with. And for me, it's not interviews, it's really more conversations, but it's the same thing.
Yeah. It's all about conversation.
Sorry to interrupt, gentlemen. We've got about just over 10 minutes. I just wanted to let you know.
Okay.
And
do we have any questions in the box
One
yet?
of the attendees, we haven't had any questions in the Q&A, but one of the attendees, Sean, wanted to be allowed to talk, if you're happy for me to do that.
Sure.
Well, we let Walden talk, so
we
sure.
trust Sean. We don't trust Walden, so sure, that's fine.
Before I do that, I just wanted to say thank you so much for correcting us about the visually impaired bit. And you're right, there's very little conversation. We're talking about racism and all that, but we're not really talking about disability. So thank you for the correction.
Oh, you're welcome.
You're welcome. Let's hear from Sean.
Sean, I've allowed you to kind of speak now. Not I've allowed you to speak in a godlike fashion, but you are.
That's what she says.
Sean, we need echo behind you, please.
Sorry, I don't have all that gear hooked up right now. I'm just I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm legally blind myself, and I didn't have any specific questions. I just wanted to say I'm here and appreciate hearing about everyone's experience.
Well, we're really glad that you're here. We appreciate it, and thanks for speaking up. We hope that this is adding value for people, and it's fun to do.
Excellent.
If nothing else, we had a lot of fun this hour.
Now cut that out.
Sounds like Jack Benny. Cut that out. Walden, anything?
Walden, anything before? Because what we'll talk about next is the thing that, what do you want to do? What's coming up? We'll talk about that in a second, but first let's see what Walden has
I think we're good. I think we're ready for the next. What do you guys think is going to happen in the podcasting in the next 2 to 3 to 5 years? Is my question to you guys.
I think we're starting to see it. Podcast began because people needed a way to listen to audio and to listen to different sorts of things. And so we started with the iPod and all that and podcast. I'm seeing a little bit of a trend that people want to see things up on YouTube because they want to watch as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really pleased that still it's mostly audio. And I hope that podcasting doesn't go by the way because people need to see it visually. I'm doing the speech in London at the end of October, and one of the things that they just emailed and asked me was to send them copies of my slides because they want to be able to duplicate those or do whatever with them. The reality is I don't use slides. I won't use slides during that, and I don't want to do that because it's important for me to be able to talk and present something that will keep the listener's attention in the audience, on the podcast, or whatever.
You
and
want
if
them
I'm
to focus on you.
I want them to focus on what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm doing slides and other things, they won't. They'll be focused on the slides and they will miss it.
Yep. Lots of people feel that way. I do too. I think if you've got lots of different media things happening around you and on boards above your head, wherever, you're taking the focus away from where it needs to be. After all, you've been there. You're there for an hour to talk about whatever you're going to talk about. Why would you have other stuff happening that would take their focus away?
Right.
At least that's how I believe. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm hoping in the next several years, and I have nothing wrong with visual stuff happening. I think that's great with regard to podcasts. But and I realize we're mostly a very visual society. 60 to 70% of the knowledge we get comes from visual fields. But I don't want that ever to detract from what happens from an audio perspective either. And sometimes it does. Sometimes people forget about the audio and they concentrate solely on video. And I think they need to coexist with each other.
There's a reason that a host is, if you will, here's the word, speaker, or a person that's delivering a presentation is a speaker. And if you are putting most of the attention on not listening to what the speaker has to say, then the speaker is not doing their job very well, and you're not getting the kind of presentation that you really ought to get. Now, I'm not at all saying there isn't room in some situations for like slides and visual kinds of effects. In fact, there are a couple of things that I do that require visual responses, but I understand them, but it's not the major part, nor should it be, of the talk that I'm giving or the podcast that I'm conducting.
Okay.
John, any thoughts?
Well, I think podcasting will continue to be a popular way of expressing yourself because people like to be on the air. They like to be on a microphone, or at least most of the people. A lot of people do, not everybody, of course. But as long as people have something to say and there are platforms available for them to say it, podcasting will continue to evolve and maybe will change a bit here and there. But as long as there are people interested in doing a podcast, then it's in pretty safe hands.
But there are lots of people who never thought that they could get into radio of any kind.
Yeah.
And now they have that ability to actually put together a podcast. And maybe they don't know necessarily what they're going to do with that podcast yet, but at least it's a way to get their message out, whatever that message is, and not have to go to all the things that we went through in terms of getting into radio. It's accepted now. And if you go back and look at lists or directories of podcasts, there's everything under the sun in those directories.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that you can imagine is there. And
but
that's
remember,
not what it used to be 40 years
but
ago.
Remember also, but remember what Steve Jobs did when the whole concept of the podcast came about. Now you could be jogging up and down your street or walking or doing so many other things, and you could hear something and you didn't have to look at anything, which says a lot in of itself. But the bottom line is that audio has been the way that we've opened up so many opportunities and so many different kinds of adventures for people. So I don't think that audio is in any way going to go away. I just hope that we don't see YouTube replacing, and I don't think we will, podcasts. It's a different animal. Unstoppable Mindset is put up on YouTube, and what we do we do record the videos and we put them up because some people like that, but the vast majority like to listen, and that won't change.
One of the things. Go ahead.
Sorry. Go on.
Go ahead.
We've got 2
And
minutes.
this is probably a
I just wanna let you
topic
know.
for another conversation. If you ever want to invite us back again, I would like to think, and I'm working on the funding of this, writing grants. I would like to see more doors open for audio theater as released as a podcast form.
It's
And
incredibly popular.
It's
Very
popular,
popular.
but I think
Yes.
it could be done better with the right funding. And I think that's one of the things I'm personally writing grants for, to make sure that door is wide open. It can allow us blind to produce shows, acting shows with well-known personality from film, TV, radio. And
with technology, we can now act in shows. We've been doing it with stuff that we've been doing over the last 2 to 3 years. Something we could never do before without technology. So I think, we need to come back and talk about that.
Yeah, and that's a whole separate 1 hour. We should go in all the wonderful experience and the relationship we have with the entertainment industry, just because we are the leading edge of doing that.
Santina, you had another?
Yes, I just wanted to say it feels like a wonderful time we've got 2 minutes to go. So I just wanted to kind of start wrapping up.
Yes.
So that I wanted to thank all of you.
Well, then you better stop us.
Here I am stopping you.
Nobody else has any other questions or anything?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Are we good or what?
They don't want us back.
You're so
they
good
don't want
that
us
no one's
back.
having
Mark.
I do not want to explore the what part of that question.
I would ring the alarm clock so that we wake everybody up.
Yeah. So you go ahead and wrap up and we'll be quiet.
So we've got a minute left. I just wanted to thank all of you for this absolutely wonderful panel. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody that kind of watches it at TPA will learn a lot. So it's been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to all of you, all 4 of you, for being here and talking to us and being part of TPA.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
We've enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun. And if you'd like, we can certainly come back and continue some of these discussions. We're happy to do that.
Absolutely. I think we could do a couple more sessions.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.